In this video, we are going to talk about writing. If you have language, it is useful to have a system to record it. That's because when I speak, what comes out of my mouth is gone the very second I said it. If I don't have an audience right where I speak, nobody will hear what important or not so important things I said. Unless, of course, I make a video just like this one. So, let's see. Suppose there was no writing. What would life be like? Suppose all of a sudden everything ever written would disappear. And of course, to get this thought experiment to go to work, you'll have to also forget about all the media that we have gotten so used to. How would we learn stuff? How would you teach stuff? Look around you, wherever you are. What would not be there if there was no writing? Our knowledge base is really dependent on what other people have already figured out. Or, as Isaac Newton said a long time ago, if I have seen further, it is only by standing on the shoulders of giants. But just for balance, not everyone thinks that writing is all that great. In Plato's Phaedro, you find Socrates saying, "It destroys memory and weakens the mind, relieving it of work that makes it strong. It is an inhuman thing." It is true that with writing, you don't have to memorize things as much. In a society without writing, all knowledge has to be transmitted orally. But that's of course possible. Many cultures lived just fine without writing systems. They had active oral traditions. All the knowledge was passed on by means of stories. In the cultures here along the northwest coast, this was normal. In the wintertime, when you couldn't go hunting, you would sit around the fire and tell stories. Important stories. Stories about how the world came about, and stories that teach kids what they should or should not be doing. The same was true in Western cultures. While writing systems existed, not everyone was privileged enough to learn to write, and so oral traditions were still vivid. Stories like Snow White, The Wolf and the 7 Young Kids, Hansel and Gretel, or The Frog Prince were part of this oral tradition. And in fact, it was 2 linguists that collected these stories. The Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm. They collected stories not only for the sake of collecting the stories, but also for collecting examples of just language. They are not only famous for their collection of fairy tales, they also did an extensive dictionary of German. It was so huge that they actually died before it was finished. So all is to say, life without writing is possible. At least it was before agriculture started to make things more complicated. And now we are here, and life without writing would indeed be extremely chaotic. Just imagine managing cities like Vancouver without a system of writing. But even in a society where writing is part of everyday life, it is still the case that not everyone is privileged enough to participate. In Canada, an estimated 22% of adult Canadians fall into the lowest level of literacy and have serious difficulty dealing with the majority of printed materials used in everyday life. They can't read road signs, fill out applications, or follow the instructions on a prescription bottle. Just imagine, what would life be like if you couldn't write? Living in a society that has a writing system. You most definitely would not be watching this video because you wouldn't be at UBC. To see what a privilege it is to be able to write, just consider this. It's a map of literacy. In the blue areas almost all people can write. But the more red you get, the less people can read. And in the black areas, less than 35% of people are literate. Now, compare this with the poverty map. There is a correlation between poor countries and countries where the majority is illiterate. So, next time you read and write something, just pause and be grateful that you are in fact able to do so. So, what is it that we are doing when we are writing? It's a way of representing language with graphic signs. So whatever you can express with language, you can express with writing. That's why it's so useful. The key ingredient that we are using in this definition here is that it represents language. There are, of course, other types of symbols and signs which can represent something. But what makes writing writing, according to this definition, is that whatever the symbol represents must be an aspect of language. It doesn't count as writing if it represents something in the world. Then it's just a symbol or a sign, not writing. To understand this difference, let us think about Prince. Right, the Prince, that is, the artist formerly known as Prince. Some years ago, he decided to change his name into a symbol, and this symbol is supposed to represent him. Crucially, the symbol is meant to represent him in the real world, not the name Prince, which would be a word and therefore language. The relation between this symbol and what it represents in the world is not mediated by language. This is what he has to say about it. The first step I have taken towards the ultimate goal of emancipation from the chains that bind me to Warner Brothers was to change my name from Prince to the love symbol. Prince is the name that my mother gave me at birth. Warner Brothers took that name, trademarked it, and used it as the main marketing tool to promote all of the music that I wrote. The company owns the name Prince and all related music marketed under Prince. I became merely a pawn used to produce more money for Warner Brothers. I was born Prince and did not want to adopt another conventional name. The only acceptable replacement for my name and my identity was the love symbol, a symbol with no pronunciation. That is, a representation of me and what my music is about. This symbol is present in my work over the years. It is a concept that has evolved from my frustration. It is who I am. It is my name. Now, back to writing. The Prince example should make it clear. There are graphic representations that represent something in the real world, that have a meaning. But that's not considered writing. Only if the graphic representation represents an aspect of language, either a sound of language or a sound meaning bundle such as a word, only then do we talk about writing. So you can think for yourself about different kinds of graphic representations of something. Is this language? Are musical scores a system of writing? Remember, you want to use the definition that we have introduced earlier, not just your own intuition from before you started this course. Do the cave drawings in Altamira count as writing? Are numbers a form of writing? Are Chinese characters? Do they count as writing systems? And if so, how do they differ from our own writing system? Is the dollar sign a form of writing? What does it represent? Interesting questions, no? So, if writing is defined as a symbolic representation of language, you will probably guess that writing systems were developed after language itself developed. In fact, compared to language, writing is a relatively recent development. It started out here, in Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. When agriculture developed here, yes, this was a thriving, lush area before it became a desert. So, when you have agriculture, you need to keep track of things. You need to know whether the harvest was good or bad, how much you were able to harvest, what time the rain comes every year. But of course, people didn't just sit down and decided, okay, what kind of symbol shall we use for particular sounds like A, E, or P, T, K? This took quite some time, and in different areas, writing systems developed in different ways. Let's see how it might have happened. Suppose you want to create a symbol for sun. You could draw something like this. But here the relation between the symbol and what it represents in the world is not mediated by language. It is a direct representation of something in the world. This is called a pictogram. Over time, the meaning of the symbol might get extended to include heat, light, and day. We call this an ideogram because it represents a whole idea, something more abstract, that's not necessarily directly observable. Note that I have to represent heat by something that indicates heat, a thermometer. I couldn't have represented heat directly. And now that the symbol is no longer a picture, a pictogram, it might have lost the form and become a little more abstract as well. But still, the ideogram represents something in the real world, even if it's an abstract idea, not a word, and thus not part of language. And hence, ideograms don't count as writing, according to our definition. Only if that symbol were to represent a word, like sun, then the relation between this symbol and what it represents in the world is mediated by language. It represents a word, and therefore it represents language. And so it counts as writing, according to our definition. Writing systems where the symbols represent whole words are called logophoric, and the symbol that represents the word is called a logogram. This is a subtle but important difference. If you represent a thing in the world, it's a pictogram or an ideogram. But if you represent a word, which is part of language, it's considered a logogram, and therefore writing. Representing language rather than the real world implies an important step. Remember that the relation between the sound sun and its meaning is arbitrary. So, if a logogram represents a word, and if the relation between the sound and its meaning is arbitrary, then logograms may also be arbitrarily related to the meaning that the word they represents. It's like a representation of another representation. Pretty complex, eh? But that's precisely how the cuneiforms in Mesopotamia came about. Pictograms had become cuneiforms by about 3000 BC. Pictograms became more and more abstract until they no longer resembled what they were supposed to represent, and in the end, they're just lines and wedges, differently organized. Cune comes from cuneos, which is Latin for wedge. That's what we do as well in our writing system, organizing some lines and curves. So let's see how. Our alphabet developed. In the beginning, there was an ox, and we start with a pictogram of an ox. A direct representation of something in the real world, the ox. The relation between this symbol and what it represents in the world is not mediated by language. But eventually this symbol got to represent the word for ox and not the thing in the world itself. Now we're talking about writing. Of course, the line between pictogram and logogram is quite blurry. But the key aspect that led to the alphabetic system that we are using today is the fact that even further down the road, this symbol became even more abstract and got to represent a glottal stop. And you know what that means, right? It's the sound that you make when you stop your airflow way down your throat with the glottis, as in uh-oh. So what does this have to do with alpha and beta with the alphabetic writing system? Well, the aleph symbol representing the glottal stop was the first symbol in the Phoenician alphabet, just like alpha is the first letter in the Greek alphabet. But in the Phoenician alphabet, there were no vowels, only consonants. If you know Semitic languages, you know why. So we have now seen two forms of what we would call a real writing system. Real writing because it consists of graphic representations of certain aspects of language. In the logographic system, a symbol represents a word, whereas in an alphabetic system, a symbol represents a sound. But there are other kinds of writing systems as well. Within our Roman alphabet, a letter corresponds more or less to a single sound, though English spelling is quite arbitrary at times, so be careful not to confuse the letter with the sound. To really represent sounds in a one-to-one manner, linguists have come up with another type of alphabet. The International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA for short. This is a writing system that we will look at next time. It allows you to write what you hear just the way it sounds. The Roman alphabet doesn't quite allow you to do that, as we shall see. The important thing for now is that the IPA is a writing system where the symbols represent single sounds. What else could we represent with symbols? A writing system that represents something in between sounds and words is the so-called syllabic writing system, found in plain Cree. This is what it looks like. Each consonant is associated with a certain shape. Like, for example, the V shape. And depending on the vowel that follows, the consonant, the shape is modified by either changing the direction. For example, P would be V and P would be an upside down V, a little hat, and O would be a V turned sideways. And A is also sideways, but just the other way around. And if the vowels are long, the difference between E and E and O and O, as well as A and A, this difference is marked by little dots above the symbol. That's the logic behind a syllabic system. Ingenious, isn't it? And here's your challenge. Can you figure out how the Chinese writing system fits into this system? What do the symbols represent? Sounds? Syllables? Words? Think about it.